Well, people have asked for a video covering USS Constitution, so I'm going to do that, and we're going to do it in the special format. So longer, better, and more direct. Specifically, this video is in response to a question that was raised in one of the early Dry Dock episodes. So, let's have a look. USS Constitution, how does she rack up against the frigates of the Royal Navy of her time? Was she just that good? Was she just lucky? Or was it a bit of both? Well, first, to understand what Constitution was up against, we need to know a bit more about her and her opponents. So the Constitution was one of the 6 original frigates ordered for the US Navy under the Naval Act of 1794, after it became clear that the original idea of a citizen militia of the sea would be about as effective as an angrily worded letter at actually stopping anyone with a navy that was capable of crossing the Atlantic. And more to the point, when you had places like Algeria thumbing their nose at the American government by seizing American merchant ships at sea and daring America's lack of a navy to do anything to stop them, something needed to be done. The initial order was supposed to be for 4 frigates carrying 44 guns each: Chesapeake, Constitution, President, and United States, along with 2 smaller vessels, the Congress and Constellation, of 36 guns each. Problems with construction ended up with Chesapeake sitting between the two at 38 guns nominal load. The designers realised that there was precisely zero chance of the fledgling United States Navy matching or coming close to the sheer numbers of ships that the British, French, Spanish, Danish, Russian, Turkish, etc. navies could deploy. Apart from anything else, there was not a single ship of the line on the orders. So the frigates would need to be stronger than average to be useful, but this would be for nothing if the first ship of the line that showed up just ran them down, so they would also need to be fast. This would inevitably mean a big expensive ship, and so using heavy thick planking and framing that was halfway between a small ship of the line and a frigate, alongside an unusually heavy armament and a lot of sail area, the ships were built. The strongest woods were also selected, with white and live oak being chosen for the frames and hull planking. Of particular note was the use of diagonal cross bracing to stiffen the ship's hull and retain strength when various parts of the structure took damage. This made the ships much more rigid than a typical ship of the period, which would also lead to less incidental damage from the ship hogging and flexing in the waves, which is basically the flexible ship's hull bending following the curve of the sea. It did have a couple of small downsides, however. With the hull less able to follow said curve of the sea, it would mean the ship wasn't quite as fast as it could otherwise have been in rougher seas, and secondly, there would be certain edge cases where the hull's lack of flexibility might cause more damage from incidents like a hard grounding. Overall, though, this innovation was somewhat ahead of its time, since it would later become widespread amongst leading navies in the 1810s and 1820s, which would lead to the final expansion of wooden ships of the line from the 100 to 120 gun vessels of the previous couple of centuries to the 140 to 160 gun ships of the 1850s. Although rated for 44 guns, which means that there were 44 gun ports cut in the hull, most ships of the period carried varied armaments depending on the commanding officer. But the Constitution's most common loadout was 30 24-pounder long cannon on the gun deck and 22 32-pounder carronades on the next deck above. A few 24-pounder bow and stern chasers rounded it all out. This was considerably heavier than most frigates, which would tend to carry 18-pounder long guns and either 12-pounder long guns or 24-pounder carronades above. The weight refers to the weight of the shot, and the type of guns were also telling. A long gun could range out in theory to 3 miles, although with decreasing accuracy, whereas a carronade was basically an artillery-sized shotgun, short range, low velocity, but therefore able to fire a much heavier shot due to the gun's overall light weight for the bore as a result of the short barrel, so this meant you could mount very heavy guns higher in the ship. The caveat to that, of course, being that these guns were not going to range as far as your long guns on the lower decks. Most naval guns of the period used either 6, 9, 12, 18, 24, 32, or in some cases 42-pound shot. Some carronades used on first rates were 68-pound weapons, and those were truly scary. Now, over to the other side. The British used a rating system to broadly describe their ships. Ships of the line were anything from the great first rates like the Victory with over 100 guns, through to the more common third rates with 64 to 80 guns. By the time period we're talking about, fourth rates of 50 to 60 guns had been derated from the line of battle, but were very uncommon due to most of them having previously been line ships and thus not best suited to long-range cruising duties as were required of frigates, as well as being very expensive for this role. The last two rates were fifth rates of 32 to 44 guns, and sixth rates which went as low as 20 guns. Anything below this was unrated and could be a sloop, a brig, a cutter, or a schooner. So we can immediately see that as built, the Constitution would be right at the upper end of the fifth rate system, and in life would actually fit, purely by gun numbers, as a fourth rate under the British system. However, British fourth rates such as HMS Leander and HMS Leopard generally carried a similar gun deck battery, but a lighter array of 12-pound long guns on the upper deck instead of carronades, making them more suited for longer range fights. Further, within the rating system itself there was a great deal of variation. Not only the number of guns, but as we have seen, the weight of the shot fired by those guns could vary considerably, as could the build of the ships. Most British ships had a slightly shorter length-to-beam ratio, and this made them quite agile and also quite sturdy, able to stand up to years of constant use. French ships of a similar rating tended to be slightly faster by having a longer length-to-beam ratio for the same number of guns, which also made them a bit more spacious, but they paid for this in a loss of agility and less durability. A French ship typically would need to spend considerably more time in dock than a British one, and could not stay out at sea for as long before the ship's timbers began to work themselves apart, which was an issue noted with captured French 80-gun ships as compared to their British 74-gun counterparts during the Napoleonic Wars. Of course, there were always exceptions on both sides, and you've had obviously other navies doing their own thing, such as the Spanish Navy deciding to build entire capital ships out of mahogany, which I'm sure is much to the distress of those antique furniture collectors out there these days. So, when we now ask the question, how does the Constitution stack up against the various frigates the Royal Navy had to hand? Well, the two navies came to blows in the War of 1812 through 1814, and those conflicts provide some good insight into the ship's strengths and weaknesses. Firstly, of course, we have to put the sixth rates out of the question entirely. They clearly wouldn't stand a chance against something like the Constitution. So, in the absence of the exceptionally rare fourth rates, that leaves us with the fifth rates. The first ship we'll look at is the 38-gun HMS Guerrière, a ship that the Constitution actually fought. At the time of the engagement, the ships were of similar age, and similarly overgunned compared to their original design. The Guerrière in this case carrying a primary firepower of 30 18-pounder long guns and 16 32-pounder carronades, 6 carronades short of the Constitution and with a long gun battery one step down in shot weight. The name might also have given away that this ship was originally French, captured in battle by the HMS Blanche. As such, the ship was relatively lightly built and had been at sea longer than was advisable for such a vessel. So it should come as no surprise that in a close-range action, the Constitution's broadside, 50% heavier than the Guerrière's, combined with a substantially stronger hull, made relatively short work of the ex-French ship. The next is the lively class frigate HMS Macedonian, similarly armed to the Guerrière, but actually about as fast as the American big frigates. This ship would have a much stronger hull, able to take more of a beating. She fought the USS United States, sister ship of the Constitution, and lost badly, outgunned and outmassed, again by about 50%. However, her stronger construction shows in the fact that the ship was successfully brought back to port and put into American service as USS Macedonian, whereas Guerrière had been unfit for use after her battle and had to be burned at sea. Our next candidate is another ex-French ship, the HMS Java, again an overgunned 38, but still heavily outgunned by the heavy American frigates, albeit not quite as much as the Macedonian and the Guerrière. She would also fight the Constitution, and despite having a green crew, was actually faster than the American ship. Her guns initially did quite well, inflicting damage and casualties, before the Constitution's heavier firepower and the Java's light French hull swung the battle decisively the Americans' way. Still, the Constitution did have to haul off for over an hour to make repairs before formally capturing the ship, and like the Guerriere, she was unfit for salvage and set on fire after the crew were taken off. Next, we'll look at the Leader class HMS Shannon. Similarly armed to the Java, this ship was British built to French lines, so quite fast, but with a heavier hull. She would fight the USS Chesapeake, the slightly smaller half-sister of the Constitution. In that battle, the American ship only had about a 20% advantage in firepower and mass, and the Shannon's superbly trained crew carried the day relatively decisively. This showed that the advantage of firepower and mass could be overcome as long as that difference was not too great, but a fight between the Shannon and the Constitution would have been an entirely different game. Lastly, we will look at HMS Endymion, a slightly larger 40-gun rated ship which would fight the USS President. Like the Leader class, she was built to French lines, but with a British flavour to her hull strength. Critically, unlike the previously mentioned ships, she carried a similar battery to the American ships of 24-pounder long guns and 32-pound carronades, albeit slightly fewer of them. This would leave the big American frigates with a 20% advantage in mass and firepower, but actually a 6 to 7% deficit in speed. This fight is a difficult one to judge, as the Endymion was ahead of a full squadron of British ships, and that meant the President was mainly interested in taking out its rigging, whilst Endymion was busy ripping apart her opponent's hull, quite successfully. Whilst much rancor and debate surrounds the end of the battle, in which President was captured, the original logs and statements made by the ships and their crews on both sides, in the immediate aftermath of the fight, make it fairly clear that the President had lost the fight with Endymion, struck her colours, and the Endymion had made to repair her rigging before taking possession, almost exactly as Constitution had done in both of her fights. In the aftermath of that battle, there were, of course, political attempts by the US government and the President's captain to downplay exactly why the President had been captured. All of this suggests that whilst the American heavy frigates were significantly superior to French-built frigates, and still held a considerable advantage over British-built 38-gun ships, they were not quite superior to the larger 40-gun Endymion and her later sisters, whose size and firepower was considerably greater than your standard fifth rate, albeit still less than the American vessels, but whose speed was such that the American ships could not escape a battle. However, given the circumstances of that particular fight, the best that could be said fairly is that it remains an open question and would likely depend on the precise circumstances of such a battle, since the unique and unusual circumstances of the Endymion versus President fight have already been pointed out. So how things would go in a simple one-on-one between the larger 40-gun British frigates and the American heavy frigates is still a bit up in the air. Broadly, however, there were very few ships like Endymion in the Royal Navy, so the general conclusion would be that against frigates, the American vessels were generally superior, albeit that, as we mentioned near the start, a fourth rate beating up a fifth rate would be the expected outcome anyway. The last part of the viewer's question originally concerned the Razays. Now, these were older third-rate ships of the line cut down by one deck to form fourth-rate frigates, in direct response to the early successes of American ships, since this was considerably faster than building a new ship. Whilst Endymion was skirting at the lower edge of fourth rate, and Constitution is definitely solidly in the middle of that field, let's take a look at a Razay that made it into the War of 1812, the HMS Majestic. At an eye-watering 58 guns for a frigate-size vessel, the Majestic was of similar size and speed to the Constitution. However, her origins gave her a number of advantages. Firstly, her hull was that of an actual ship of the line, and even more durable than the Americans as a result. Next, again due to her hull shape, form and sturdiness, as well as the sail area, which was designed for a much larger and heavier ship, she could maintain her speed much better in rough seas and weather, giving her a conditional speed advantage in some circumstances. But most critically, again due to her origins as a full ship of the line, she carried a gun deck battery of 28 32-pounder long guns and 28 42-pounder carronades on the upper deck. This gives her a 40% firepower advantage over the Constitution, almost as great a percentage advantage as the American ship had enjoyed against Guerriere and Java, and more critically, all of those guns were capable of punching through even the strong oak hull of the Constitution, whereas the 18-pounder guns of Java and Guerriere had quite often failed to do so. With that kind of firepower, a close-range fight between the two ships, assuming equal crews, is only going to go the Majestic's way. It must be noted, however, that Alvarezes carried an extensive battery of 18-pounder long guns and further 9-pound guns instead of carronades on the upper deck, which drops their firepower to about equal with that of the Constitution. However, in these cases, the lessons of the USS Essex must not be forgotten. The Essex was a smaller 32-gun American frigate that also took part in the War of 1812, but she was captured when, armed mostly with short-range carronades, it went up against a 32-gun British frigate armed with long guns, which promptly sat beyond effective carronade range and pounded the Essex into submission. Therefore, although perhaps closing to a knife fight in these other razes might not have been quite as decisive a battle, their long-range battery is significantly superior, since the American heavy frigate's 24-pound long guns versus an equal battery of 32-pounders, with the lighter guns able to work away at the American masts, rigging and crew, would hand these other razes an advantage in long-range combat. Therefore, in overall conclusion, the American heavy frigates typified by the USS Constitution can be said to have a definitive advantage over the vast majority of other frigates in service at the time, albeit that certain British 38s such as the Shannon could probably make the fight closer to even depending on the relative quality of the two ships' crews. They would further have roughly equal chances against the very few largest frigates in the Royal Navy, such as Endymion, but they would be at a decisive disadvantage facing off against a Razade ship of the line.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to tag your question with Q&A if you want to leave a question for the dry dock.